All right, let's begin. My name is David Fields, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center for East Asian Studies here at University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's my privilege to serve as a moderator for the event today. Today's sponsor is the Institute for Regional and International Studies National Resource Center. The IRIS NRC supports and enhances global awareness and inspires informed thinking about the complexities of our world. We provide resources and expertise to K through 12 and post-secondary educators, students, and the community at large. We also have two co-sponsors for today's event. One is the Center for East Asian Studies and the Havens Wright Center for Social Justice. We invite you to visit their websites and follow them on social media. If you're interested in this event, it's likely that the other centers are also doing events that you would also be interested in. Essie Lechner will be running tech support, so if you have any challenges, please use the chat function to contact her. We will be recording today's event and sharing the link in a post-event email. You will only show on the recording if your microphone is turned on to speak. So we are joined today by Dr. Van Jackson, who is the Senior Lecturer of International Relations at Victoria University of Wellington and a Senior Research Scholar at Security and Context, where he is also co-director of the Multipolarity Great Power Competition and Global South Project. He has also held many positions in American, Canadian, and New Zealand think tanks. There's too many to mention here, but he's had a long career doing this sort of work. He is also the host of the acclaimed Undiplomatic podcast, of which I am a subscriber and regular listener. And on this podcast, you can hear him give excellent analysis and occasionally say some naughty words, which is why I think it's the only podcast that I subscribe to that has the little E on it next to it. And he is also the author of the Undiplomatic newsletter. Prior to joining Victoria University, Dr. Jackson taught at Hawaii Pacific University, the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, Georgetown University, and Catholic University of America. He has also held fellowships with the Council on Foreign Relations, CNAS, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and Pacific Forum CSIS. Although he writes, researches, and speaks about a wide range of topics, from defense strategy to progressive foreign policy and international relations theory, he is originally known as an expert on Korean affairs. And as I'm a historian of US-Korean relations, I've been following his work for a long time, and he is here today to speak about his recent book, Pacific Power Paradox. So please join me in welcoming Van Jackson.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for everybody joining and for the IRIS NRC for hosting. So I guess there's like an inconvenient truth. There's no naughty words in this one, by the way, but or I'm gonna try my best. An inconvenient truth about understanding Asia today is that for the past 45, 46 years, it has existed uneasily, kind of precariously within a cocoon of American hegemony. Like it's existed within America's shadow for better and for worse, right? And that's changing a bit, and I'm happy to talk about that. But I think you have to make sense of a region in terms of how powerful actors relate to less powerful actors and vice versa. And in Asia, no actor for the past generation and a half has been more powerful than the US. And I'll explain this in a minute, but that's not actually a good thing. And that too is changing, right? Like distributions of power are changing, and America's role in Asia, it's been pretty checkered. And as we try to cope with new distributions of power, we ought to be doing so from a place of understanding how our power has affected this region and intersected with it. So I want to get to all of that, but I also need to kind of set up this discussion around this book that I published, I guess it was like a year and a half ago now, called Pacific Power Paradox, and that's kind of heavily what my talk is anchored in. And so, how do I come to this, and where does this book that I use to make sense of Asia today kind of come from? So I started life as a foreign policy practitioner in Washington after serving in the Air Force. And I was kind of taught to see the world through the lens of what we still tend to call liberal hegemony or liberal primacy, or if we want to be really euphemistic, it's US leadership of the world, right? And it was a view that was basically unfalsifiable and unchallengeable. And it assumed that American power was a global public good, especially in Asia, but I mean globally, right? And so you had, now he's retired, but the Harvard professor Joseph Nye, very famous guy, he called Asia, he called us Asia's oxygen. You know, John Mearsheimer, the gadfly realist, he called America Asia's pacifier, right? So I'm living, embodying those narratives, as a policy guy. And while I'm working in Obama's Pentagon during the day, I'm doing my PhD at night. And I was one of these guys who, even though I was in uniform, I was opposed to the Iraq War, right? Even at that time. And so I went to the Pentagon kind of with rose-colored glasses on, kind of, hoping to be a force for peace. It's a different way of being, And then with my PhD studies at night in parallel, I was getting exposed to a research literature devoted to this empirical puzzle called the East Asian Peace. And so the first time I heard that phrase, I was like, what's the Asian peace? That sounds important. What are we talking about here? Right. So, what we're talking about here is the absence of interstate wars in Asia since 1979, right? It's this period of remarkable relative stability in Asia, right? And Asia is actually more stable than even Eurasia or Eastern Europe. And I mean, you can see that even right now in 2025. So as a precise measurement, the Asian peace is this dramatic decrease in mass casualty violence and an absence of new interstate wars in East Asia and in the Pacific Island region since 1979. But the Asian peace does not and cannot include the Indian Ocean region because in 1999 we of course have the Kargil War between India and Pakistan, and we've had multiple other conflicts within South Asia including in the 80s. So like South Asia has been pockmarked with wars during this same period coincident with the Asian peace. And so what that means is whatever accounts for the Asian peace does not apply to South Asia. And if we included South Asia in our observations of this, peace puzzle, it would erase the puzzle. There would be no long peace to speak of. And so there's like a geographical caveat to what we're talking about with like the Asian peace here, right? But the Asian peace is also not super peaceful. So during this period, the Korean War remained in a frozen armistice. For most of the 1980s, Vietnam militarily occupied Cambodia. In the Philippines and in other places, there have been brutal counterinsurgency and pacification campaigns. In East Asia, especially, we have a lot of structural violence because kleptocracy and oligarchy have been a rampant feature of US centered global economic order, right? We've had civil wars and a genocide in Myanmar, right? We've had nuclear proliferation and nuclear crisis that nearly ended the Asian peace, most acutely with North Korea. Everybody kind of knows that, but like there's a way in which the Asian peace is therefore a misnomer. Like it's not been peaceful, it's been stable, right? But it is more peaceful than most other regions. And that label Asian peace is still the best shorthand we have for this phenomenon that is desirable and that is kind of a global public good. The peace itself, right? Peace is a global public good, right? And so the absence of interstate wars, it's not nothing. And this matters because the answer to the question of what is to be done with like US foreign policy or big questions about grand strategy, they ought to be driven by, or at least informed by, an understanding of what accounts for the Asian peace. Because if we can explain it, we can sustain it. So, anyway, I'm working back to like my how did this come about? I'm working in the Pentagon, doing my PhD at night, and all these scholars are talking about the Asian piece. Almost none of them are talking about U.S. power. And then I go to the Pentagon during the day and I see US policymakers, I'm around policymakers who are talking about US power almost exclusively. They never heard the word peace, right? The word peace never even comes out of their mouths. And so there's something like a Mars and Venus thing happening here. Like there's a clear gap between the way scholars thought about the Asian piece and the way that Washington policy folks in like mainstream security studies thought or didn't think about the same phenomenon, you know? And I should say this is like circa 2011, 2012. So I'm sitting for the better part of a decade marinating in the back of my mind this gap between like how policymakers and scholars tend to think about this stuff, and the branding of the phenomenon Asian peace. Just like I can't, it's like tattooed on my mind. And that's sitting in my head for like a decade before I start writing the book. And the way the book ended up starting out, it was not actually going to confront that gap between Washington and Asian peace scholars. Like the original contract was supposed to be a critique of Trump as a unique threat to the Asian peace. And so the story was going to be that, I mean, rehashing some of the stuff I've just said was like, after a century and a half of recurring interstate wars and mass casualty violence, the period starting in 1979 has been remarkably stable, right? They, but, and then Trump. And so that's what I was going to do. And there were very obvious ways that Trump's foreign policy was putting um, stability at risk, you know? But what really jarred me as I was doing the research was that there was nothing unique in Trump's approach to Asia once you started kind of like comparing it to the actual historical record since 1979, you know, going back over the old like national security memos and speeches and strategy documents, especially in the Reagan era, none of the things that we clutched our pearls about, and I'm including myself in that, during the first Trump years was unprecedented, you know, when it came to Asia stuff. Like Trump was accentuating habits of militarism and domination in our foreign policy that were already there. He wasn't so deviant, but we had narrated our own role in the region in such a way that we had kind of like erased reality a little bit. We erased the inconvenient parts. So Trump was like a difference of degree. He was more mask off about things, but not kind, right? And this kind of was a mind, I said no naughty words, a mind screw for me. Like, coming to terms with that forced me to revisit this gap that I had seen so long ago, right? Between the factors that scholars widely sort of understood to be responsible for the Asian piece, and then the factors that Washington kind of took for granted. And, again, is a Mars and Venus thing. So, the book Pacific Power Paradox was an attempt to deal with all of that, like it's trying to do an honest critical reckoning with America's share in causing the Asian peace, but also in like imperiling it and threatening it. So I end up having three interlinked arguments, which I can just run through in brief here. Um, One is that the Asian piece is a layered piece, which is to say that there's no single source of it, and that in that way, for a period of time, the Asian piece was overdetermined. So there's strong evidence that U.S. allies and general deterrence, these traditional factors, they played a positive role sometimes, but I try to suggest not generally. And in fact, there were like many moments where they were counterproductive and were a problem. I'll get to that. Um, but the crucial factors for peace in the region have really been economic interdependence and Sino-US détente or cooperation, right? The China and the US had developed a basically like strategically balanced, positive relationship that was good for each other and good for the region. And that, more than anything else, has been the keystone of the Asian peace, right? So it just didn't exist in isolation from other factors. So, like, the Asian peace is a layered piece, it's bigger than any one factor or actor. Um, the second argument, which follows logically from that, is what I end up calling the Pacific Power Paradox, which, yeah, that's the title of the book, but that's also like a branding for it's like a concept, right? So the Pacific Power Paradox is a much more accurate narrative about America's role in the Asia Pacific since 1979 than the story that Washington tells itself about its role in the region. So I have this revealing quote from Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State. And she said, let me find it here actually. Asia is eager for our leadership and our business. We have underwritten regional security for decades because of our irreplaceable role in the Pacific. And, when I hear that kind of thing now, I feel like it's reeks of hubris. Um, but I mean, that's probably still the prevailing view in DC, but like back then it definitely was. And that's what I was fed growing up in that system. And the trouble with that is that it's just not correct. That's American exceptionalism, which is a pathology based on cherry picked history. And so the Pacific Power Paradox is my branding for the fact that America has presented three faces toward Asia since 1979. One of those faces is the preferred face, the heroic face, the face of the vital bulwark, right? There have been a couple moments where the US kept a crisis from escalating to war through prudence, through restraint, and then also, frankly, through a lot of luck, right? The second face, so the heroic narratives are not evidence free. Like, there's some evidence to support that. It's just slim relative to the balance of other goings on in the region, right? The second face is that of the imperious superpower, right? We make predatory, even bullying decisions that redirect insecurity toward others, that heighten risks of conflict, that give rise to crises in the first place. We end up having to prudently manage crises because we helped cause crises to happen. you know so that's a paradox. And then the third face of the paradox is that of the aloof hegemon, right? Some of Asia's near miss crises since 1979 have had nothing directly to do with us. They were managed without us sometimes, and we are often not as important as we'd like to think, which is a little bit of an ironic take for a book that is approaching Asia from a kind of US vantage point. But it is what it is. And then my third argument, so those are the three faces of America toward the Asian piece. Third argument is that Asia today, Asian security today is far more brittle than it's been in the past generation. And the reason for that has a lot to do with US choices. So the sources of the Asian piece, especially great power détente and interdependence, but to a lesser extent, regional institutions and democratization as a trend, these things collectively are kind of useful as a scorecard for understanding, like, when US choices are taking risks against the Asian peace. If these things have been useful for sustaining the Asian peace, and then we take actions that undermine them, then we are taking risks against the Asian peace logically, right? And so the controversy of the book is that this entire analysis allows that America is not always a beneficent exceptionalist power, right? And that is like truly hard for some people to swallow. 10 years ago, that would have been impossible for me to swallow. And when the book came out in 2023, there were a lot of Asia hands in DC, including some of my friends, who they felt like their identity was attacked by this argument. That's how like serious that's how like deeply held their narratives are. And it's almost offensive to point out evidence that undermines or contradicts the narrative. And that makes the project all the more worthwhile, all the more necessary in my mind. That's what I'm not saying this is the best history, but that's what the best history does in my mind. Anyways, so when you look through the historical record, I feel like the conclusion that I drew is like the only conclusion you can honestly draw. Like that's why I reluctantly embraced the argument that I did. And it's important because a better, more sort of stabilizing relationship to Asia starts with recognizing this paradox of America as a quote unquote Pacific power. The reality that America has been Asia's aloof hegemon, vital bulwark, and imperious superpower. We've been Asia's arsonist and its firefighter. And that is, I don't, it makes you feel some type of way. And so when I talk about this stuff to American audiences, the big question I often get asked is how has the US threatened Asia? What do you mean? Threatened the Asian peace, America? Like, can you first of all like read the book? But I mean, that's the thing that I sort of most often get pressed on. But interestingly, when I talk to Asian audiences, nobody's ever asked me that, because they know. And and so that's noteworthy in itself. But it also makes me prepared to address the question. So like maybe I should say a word about how the US has threatened the region, because it takes direct and indirect forms. And this is a little bit of a question of like, how do you tell a story? How do you scope an analysis? What counts as observables kind of thing, right? So 2017 is the most obvious direct example, right? The North Korean nuclear crisis. So North Korea did not change in 2017. We changed in 2017. North Korea had been on a very predictable track that was contrary to our preferences, but it was predictable. It was known. Nothing really surprised us. But we started escalating coercive signaling against them. We started threatening fire and fury, and then they would reciprocate in kind, you know? And so we started talking about a bloody nose option against Kim Jong un. We were threatening violence if they did certain kinds of non-violent weapons tests. The North Koreans, for as belligerent as they are in their foreign policy, they were not threatening violence in response to non-violence, but we were. They were threatening violence in response to violence. So, North Korea, I would not call them a peaceful actor by any stretch, but you cannot put all the danger of 2017 on North Korea. We have to own some of that. And until we do, and we haven't so far, we're never going to be willing to actually do arms control or meaningful peace diplomacy with them. We are going to like have a self-constrained toolkit for managing stability and managing that relationship, because we're still viewing everything as like it's the baddies doing the bad things. The 1994 nuclear crisis with North Korea was kind of similar in a way. It was less Trumpy, but it was the same dynamic. We played a menacing role in conjunction with North Korea. And it's generally the case. Like it takes two to tango in a crisis. It's not just like one guy being evil and the other guy being good. That's silly. And not just with North Korea, like in the 80s under Reagan, the nuclear war scares we had, include especially in like 81, 82, 83 was like a very sort of dicey period of time that people have like memory hold. But that period of crisis had mostly to do with Reagan's military buildup and this idea in the US Navy that they were obsessed with and making real, called horizontal escalation. It was the deliberate courting of risk and spreading and expanding of risk, creating a 3.5 war, like literally a world war construct, and then trying to build a military for it, which is why the defense budget doubled under his 8 years of presidency, you know? And that's the context within which the nuclear war scares happen, right? So we are a part of that, But there are indirect ways, and I think these are actually more important that we threatened the Asian peace, right? These are more important because, individual crises are moments, they're snapshots. But they emerge from historical processes. They emerge from a context. And so you can prime the context to make crises more or less likely. And so allies in the Washington imagination are the great and the good. Well, not under Trump, but generally, historically speaking, allies are the great and the good. They are necessary. They are evidence of our greatness and goodness, and they're a stabilizing force. Allies are supposed to be this vital thing, and they do play some positive role sometimes in the Asian peace. But in 1985, we cut off New Zealand permanently as an ally because their government made one decision we did not like because their national preferences were in conflict with a US Navy regulation. And we basically went scorched earth on them for this instead of accommodating them. Also in 1985, we coerced Japan into revaluing its currency so that it would reduce exports of its cars to the US. It was called the Plaza Accords, right? We were going to destroy them with tariffs if they didn't meet our demand. They did. They capitulated. Japan revalues its currency, but it was an export-based economy, and that actually harmed their economy, right? Within a couple years, Japan slides into a recession. There was more going on than just the decline of exports in that, but they go into a recession and then they basically never recover, right? And so we pushed them in that direction of recession long term because we saw Japanese affluence and the concentration of economic influence as a threat to our own hegemony. And so we took steps to kneecap them. And this is like pretty on the record. Like, George Shultz, and his Secretary of State for Reagan in his memoir, like he admits this. And so this is a well-known story, but it's misremembered in our narratives, right? Sometimes it's even erased in our narratives. And then separate from allies, regional institutions, the East Asia Summit, ASEAN, et cetera, right? APEC. These regional institutions are a meaningful part of the Asian peace. They're kind of like a supplementary source of kind of predictability in the region. Um, when I worked in the Pentagon, though, it was popular to mock Asian regionalism and multilateralism as talk shops, as feckless, as literally worse than useless. And those are direct quotes from a prominent DC think tanker, by the way. But insofar as regional institutions are useless talk shops, we actively made it that way, right? Since the 1980s, US policy consistently tried to make Asian regional institutions weak and informal. And we went scorched earth on any regional attempts to build institutions that did not have us at the center. Famously, like we vetoed every regional arrangement that might have excluded us. And famously, Japan tried to set up an Asian monetary fund in the 90s. Larry Summers shut it down, right? And there are a lot of economic and fiscal ways in which we've threatened the Asian peace. And I can talk about that more if you want, because it's really kind of devastating. But one point I would make is that the neoliberal economic order that we sort of benefited from disproportionately as a overall country, and that we deliberately set out to design, that neoliberal economic order shovels foreign profits into shell companies and into financial assets, and we couldn't have had military primacy without that flow of capital because of how we finance our military buildups, right? And that system prevented economic redistribution in Asian societies. It encouraged kleptocracy and the offshoring of capital accumulation in these East Asian economies. And it required labor repression from these these Asian, quote unquote tigers, because export competitiveness has historically required labor repression. It's the labor repression differential that makes them competitive in the export market, right? And that's not a good thing from the perspective of structural violence and therefore governance and stability and democracy, and that is not just something in the distant past either. That's like up to right now. And so, how democratic or stable can you even try to be as a government if you have to systematically repress the rights of workers so that you can have profits to offshore into New York real estate or whatever? That's a messed up system. And as we know, half the world is rebelling against that system right now. So my point is just that, like, in many ways, not just one way, the political economy of US hegemony has indirectly caused greater insecurity in this region. And what I document in the book is like a very large gap between that reality and then what policymakers imagine they're doing. Like, we think that because we have good intentions that we can do no wrong, and that is just like self-flattering nonsense. So, coming to today-ish, why do I say the Asian piece is at risk now? It's the short version is that it's pretty much because all of the sources of regional stability have given way to volatility. Economic interdependence has been replaced by economic nationalism and like a logic of decoupling. Democratization is obviously in decline as like a regional and a global trend. And then, most important of all, the biggest risk that we're taking against the Asian peace is the one that has become naturalized as conventional wisdom since 2018, which is rivalry with China. China and the United States have replaced cooperation with competition. China would have been a spoiler in the Asian peace long ago, if not for this modus vivendi of cooperation with the US. And so before détente was established, China had a revolutionary foreign policy. It was into military adventures. The last war before the Asian peace starts is a Chinese invasion of Vietnam. And so, I think the reality, like, I'm not a China hand, but like Deng Xiaoping needed cooperative relations with the US to reform the PLA and to prioritize national development over nationalist revanchism. And that is a similar wager that like most of Asian governments were trying to make at the time too. And so détente between the great powers facilitated regional economic interdependence, and cooperation of that kind helped to stabilize the global economy after the 2008 financial crisis. Like, it actually paid off in a direct way, not just indirect ways. And people memory hole all of that, everything I just talked about. But like, by pursuing rivalry, we have given up on a major source of the Asian peace. And it's on behalf of a bad wager, because there's no security to be had in geopolitical rivalry, which incidentally I published a book just last week that makes this precise argument. Can you see this? I don't like, you know, so there's more I could say about what's happening now. I'd love to talk about it, but like, maybe it's best to address that in Q&A. So I think I've like hit my time here, so I'll stop now. Thanks.
All right. Van, thank you so much for that presentation. I've been taking notes furiously. It was really interesting what you were saying about how, this argument being not so well received in Washington, but when you say that the U.S. has been a threat to a Asian peace, when you give these talks in the region, there's almost no question or pushback about that. And it reminded me, in 2019 here at Wisconsin, we hosted a Japanese scholar named Toshihiro Nakayama from Keio University, who sadly has passed away since. But he gave a talk on how Japan handled the Trump shock. And the whole point of his talk was that Japan handled the Trump shock pretty well compared to a lot of other countries. because from their perspective, it wasn't all that different from what had been done before. I mean, it was a little bit different, but they already had a kind of a playbook. They already understood that the United States interests and the Japanese interests were not necessarily aligned. And in some ways, they saw Trump as kind of maybe an opportunity because he was flatterable. You know, he was there. There were buttons that you could push with Trump that maybe you couldn't push with others. And so I was thinking about Nakayama's presentation as I was hearing.
That's funny. Yeah.
As I was reading your book as well, I really like the overall paradigm. Of course, though I'm a historian, so when you talk about the United States being East Asia's arsonist and firefighter, I know you're talking about the Asian peace, so you started in 1979, but I can't help but think of the Korean War as, you know, the United States being the chief arsonist and the firefighter at the same time. And, you know, as two people who study Korea know, you know, there's no doubt that so many Koreans are supportive of the United States alliance. You know, they want the American presence on the peninsula, but they're also very knowledgeable that had it not been for decisions made in Washington in 1945 and again in 1949, the Korean Peninsula might never have needed saving. So I know that's outside of the realm of this book, but I feel like when you zoom out, this question of really American ambivalence in the room in East Asia really even comes sharper into focus. But now I'll ask a question.
Well, you're making a good point. Like the essence, the kernel of the thesis could have extended much farther back in time, I think. Like there would be evidence to support it. Yeah.
Yeah, even we could, you know, talk about the 1930s and United States policy towards Japan and Manchuria and such places. But I had a question I was going to to talk about the present, but actually I didn't know that you just published a book last week. So please slow down, like save some for the rest of us, save some topics. But because you've just published that book, I want to ask you, you know, what should the US approach to China be? And I'll ask you for a minute to just like, let's suspend politics for a moment. Okay, let's just talk about an ideal world where rational policymakers would look at the situation and devise the best policy in the US national interest, irrespective of what this might mean for their domestic constituencies. What should the United States approach to China be? Maybe what should it have been for the last 10 years? In your ideal world, how would this have played out?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, ideally, how America relates to China is subordinate to how America relates to the world differently, right? And I think that that necessarily always goes together, right? And so relating to the world differently is about trying to not secure ourselves by exporting insecurity toward others at a sort of philosophical level or a first principles level. The way that a certain section of policymakers and politicians think, J.D. Vance has said this explicitly, that security is a scarce commodity. And to believe that security is a scarce resource is very problematic, because A, that's not true, but B, that necessarily leads you to take actions that presume you're going to have to make others sacrifice and eat it so that you can be okay, right? It's a highly, I mean, that's a dark, dark vision of the world. But that he has been very explicit that that's the analytical assumption at the core of it, you know, and that's actually what primacy is. So, like American strategy toward the world has been primacist for the past 40 years. That really kind of starts in the Reagan administration, although you can find antecedents to it. And this means that primacy, by definition, in political science, there's like actual objective standards that we use to name a strategy as a primacy strategy. I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but it's basically like the only threats you really care about are great powers. And the only real goal you have is to make sure that you retain the lion's share of power in the international system. And no one is allowed to approach you. And this is why we got so spooked, yellow peril, by Japan in the 80s. Even though they didn't have a military to speak of, it was like they could become economic hegemons, and that violates our notions of primacy, you know? And the way we reacted to Japan then has so many echoes with how we've been reacting to China in the past 10 years. The difference being China has never been a client state of ours, and China has a pretty serious military, you know? So like imagine if you would say that about Japan, it's like, well, all this would have happened 40 years ago, you know? So relating to the world in a less security is scarce kind of way, that's the idea. And that means literally we have to abandon primacy in favor of anything else. Anything else would be better than a sort of primacist mindset. You know, the most prudential thing, the most conservative, better alternative would be a balance of power strategy. And when it comes to China, that would mean figuring out ways to accommodate their power in the region, and certainly not wasting all of our diplomatic capital chasing them around the world, trying to get Huawei banned and all this stuff. It's like, what are we doing? Why are we spending money trying to, kneecap the telecoms infrastructure they're trying to provide to poor countries when we don't provide it for them? So that would be like the shortest, and that was not a very pithy answer, but that would be like the shortest answer to that.
Oh, that was great. Thank you so much for that. We have questions in the chat, and so I'll go to a few of those. And one of them I feel like directly kind of touches on what I was going to ask you next, which is, okay, what if we factor in domestic politics and that reality? What would be the best? And so we have a question from Tony who asks, how do you view the new tariffs that the U.S. has placed on China and the Chinese response? Is the Trump administration rather trying to achieve something, or is this just truly the next stage in an ongoing trade war?
So I'm going to try to keep this short, and if you can cut me off at any point, but there's like a larger explanation here. So rivalry between the US and China, I think, should be understood as an ethno-nationalist competition within capitalism. So up until the 1970s, advanced economies, what it meant to be an advanced economy was to be like a producerist manufacturing economy, right? That became less profitable as post-war Europe and some of the East Asian governments, their manufacturing became more competitive. So profits dropped. As profits fell, investment capital in advanced economies looked for profits through services more than through production. And this is how production gets offshored. And this is how the East Asian tigers grow, because they start doing the production, right? So the era that we now call neoliberal globalization has been an era of financialization and deindustrialization in the West. And during my lifetime, manufacturing was never a sign of an advanced economy because of all this, right? Because manufacturing was an activity that you outsourced to the third world or the global south or whatever, right? You're exploiting new markets and cheap labor, right? And so China was a major beneficiary of all of that process, and that's how it became the world's factory. So this actually has directly to do with the question of the tariffs, right? That economic model of the neoliberal economic order has created massive inequality in the world, and it's been producing less and less growth. It's not paying off. The dividends of globalization are not paying off anymore, right? Or not like they used to. And so the US, China, the rich nations that can afford it, they have decided that the answer to an era of low growth is zero-sum economic nationalism. So what we've been seeing, and this tariffs are part of this, is that states that are powerful are mobilizing to grab a greater share of a shrinking global economic pie for their, quote unquote, nation. But to do that means you have to compete with other states doing the same thing. That's US and China in rivalry, right? But also you have to stoke nationalism if you're going to be using the states in this kind of way to grab a greater share, right? You have to exploit nationalism as a kind of ideology. There's no way around it. But as some of us know, stoking nationalism is antagonistic, right? And both China and the US are doing it. And this process does not end well for anybody. And it's being driven by these economic realities that we've created. And because we are blind to the economic determinants of rivalry, we fall into these romantic flag-waving notions of nationalist explanations for why China is hiding under our bed. And that commits us to the path to World War III. Tariffs are one of the ways that we are trying to grab a shrinking share of the economic pie. And I find them problematic because we have been the lopsided beneficiary of a world of low tariffs, first of all, but also because tariffs are a tax on workers. And so that's a problem. Um, and ultimately, it kind of pushes us in this direction of World War III as part of the larger confrontation that we have with China. And I find all of that problematic. Having said that, there are uses for tariffs sometimes, just not in this case, I don't think.
All right.
Sorry, again, long.
Oh, okay. We'll go Jeannie, and then Nick. We'll take you after that, and then Essie. I'll just go down the list. So we have a question from Jeannie. It said you mentioned the U.S. as having a scorched earth policy with New Zealand in 1985, which I have to be honest, Van. When I heard the word scorched earth in relation to Anzus, I cringed just a little bit. Since we're also talking about conflicts where scorched earth has been a policy, I wasn't sure that exactly fit exactly.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, can you elaborate on what that was? What are you referencing there in 1985?
Yeah, fair point. It's a big deal in New Zealand where I'm sitting right now. So New Zealand was a treaty ally of the US, and they've always gotten along, blah, blah, blah. In 1985, the government, New Zealand's also an anti-nuclear, nuclear-free nation. And so as part of their national policy, they said they will not allow nuclear weapons on their territory or in their waters. So the US Navy, some of its vessels and submarines have nukes, right? But as a matter of just bureaucratic policy in the Navy for the US, they neither confirm nor deny whether nukes are on board. And so New Zealand, if a US Navy ship is going to come into New Zealand, this was what the fight was about, it needs to declare whether it has nukes on board. But it's US Navy policy to not declare whether nukes are on board. So this is a country's national interest versus one branch of the US military's regulation, basically. We could have overridden that. We could have accommodated that, or we could have not sent a ship to New Zealand knowing that they have this constraint. Instead, we said, no, you comply with us. Your nation has to effectively bend the knee to our one branch of the military's preference. And as a matter of like national pride and their seriousness about disarmament, they wouldn't do that. And so Reagan effectively suspended but killed the alliance, the treaty alliance with New Zealand. And so now we've remained like friends. Our intelligence sharing and stuff still goes on in some limited ways, but that security treaty is not in force anymore ever since, basically. That's what I was referring to. No violence, nothing like that.
Okay, Nick, can you go ahead and unmute yourself? Yes.
Hi, can everyone hear me? You can hear me? Great, wonderful. Well, I just wanted to say first off that I've been loving the chat. I obviously I haven't read your book, but it has to go on my list. Maybe I'll get to it between my law school readings if there's time. But I have to say that your thesis that United States foreign policy and the thought around it is sort of marked by American exceptionalism is something that strikes a chord with me, right? And also the trend of the United States exporting the insecurities from the United States' side to our allies and to other countries in Asia also seems to be something that, I've seen and noticed quite a bit. So that also like resonated with me, especially the dissonance between the two, considering how, exporting the risks to your allies and to your partners is not what leaders would do. It's not what good leaders would do. It's not what exceptional leaders would do. But I think my question is relating to China, sort of as Director Fields was talking about. how exactly do you think our relationship, if we were to be more cooperative with China, would work? Because the détente was certainly extremely helpful, as you've said, to Asian security, to there being this Asian peace, this long peace. However, the Chinese economy is not what it used to be in the 1970s and the 1980s and even the 1990s. They are trying quite successfully, I would say, to tech up, to no longer be simply a manufacturing economy. So it sort of is in this, as you called it, and I love the phrase, I agree with it quite a bit, this ethno-nationalistic war within capitalism, right? How exactly would we cooperate with each other, considering that we're both, in my view, competing for maybe that services, the designs, that sort of thing. And it seems like we're racing to go and find our next Asia, Southeast Asia, where we can produce these things, right?
Yeah, great question. I mean, so the US EV industry, which is obviously going to be a totally different ballgame under Trump than it was under Biden, might be in a lot more trouble. But it was kind of in trouble under Biden too, but it was just on a time delay because the US, the big three, the American manufacturing, it actually needs technology and knowledge, IP from China because they're the world leaders in this sector, and it's only through collaboration with Chinese firms, partnership with Chinese firms, that American EVs can be competitive, which is like very ironic, but the approach that Biden had taken was to basically firewall off Chinese competition, and the tariffs are of course part of that. Tax credits were also part of that, but that's hugely problematic. I mean, the situation now is even worse. But so like we needed cooperation in that form. And it was up to we needed China to cooperate with us. And we've cut ourselves off from that, not even realizing that we needed them more than they needed us in that respect. But we had something to offer because if they could sell into the American market, which they basically can't now, but if we had that carrot to offer them, to entice them. But we've gone totally the other way. The other aspect of cooperation, though, that I think this is a bank shot, it's very ambitious, and it's a very unpopular idea. But what I think could actually work logically is that we provide financing to the global south for a green transition in the form of subsidizing the export of Chinese overproduction of green tech, EVs, solar panels, which is already cheap, already very competitive in the market. And since they have a surplus of it, we finance the export of that surplus to the global south to accelerate a green transition in the global south. And by doing that, and then we ask China in return to cancel and restructure some of its massive sovereign debt holdings in the global south. So China gets something and China gives something. And it happens because of our willingness to, again, work with them, not to undermine them. And the consequence of if we did this is that the global south would be in a much more fiscally solvent position, and that would unlock and adapt to the new green world or whatever. But that would unlock sort of latent suppressed markets in the global south. Like the current world that we live in right now has no sources of future growth except for war, which is part of why we're on the path to World War III. Even AI, the magical unicorn that's supposed to like solve and cause all our problems, like it's only the only way it's profitable for the VCs that are investing in artificial intelligence is to sell the stuff to the Pentagon. And to do that, you have to keep conjuring up images of World War III and keep China under our bed and stuff. And so like we're on a nightmare path, man. And we can circumvent all of this and even possibly have an answer to this. Where does future global growth come from? If we can activate the global south as this giant untapped market by helping make them fiscally solvent. But it first requires Sino-US détente. You know what I mean? So relations before states, you know.
All right. Thank you so much, Van Jackson. This was such a rich conversation. And I think if I learned anything, I think it would be that the way forward would be to force everybody who works in the Pentagon to get a PhD at night. And then the policy outcomes would be so much better, and our universities would be full of students. So I want to thank today's
You're here.
sponsors. I want to thank the IRIS NRC, Center for East Asian Studies, and the Havens Wright Centers. And I believe you can go to their websites, iris.wis.edu or eastasia.wis.edu, to find out about other events coming forward. So thank you very much, and I hope everyone has a good evening.